Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. My name is Anique de Bruin. I'm the Chief Research and Insights Officer here at CISCRP, and welcome to First Look, the Perceptions and Insights Study for 2025. We're very excited to reveal some of the results and discuss some of their implications with you all today. I'm joined here by a few of my colleagues and two guests. What I'll do is I'll first turn it over to Ken Getz, CISCRP founder and board chair, for a few opening remarks. Ken?
Thank you, Anique. I also want to personally welcome everyone and thank you all for joining us today. The current global operating environment for clinical research, there's so much uncertainty, there's so much change. It is absolutely essential that we routinely conduct and share and discuss empirical evidence, robust empirical evidence on public and patient attitudes and perceptions and their experiences in clinical research. CISCRP has been supporting such an effort through the Global Perceptions and Insights Study for more than a decade. And this research, as you'll see today, the Perceptions and Insights 2025 study, as in all of our past studies, really characterizes major trends, identifies critical issues and challenges, as well as opportunities that all offer insight for us into ways that we can more effectively educate and engage with the public and patients as partners, as true collaborators in clinical research. I want to recognize the incredible work of the CISCRP team, and I just want to express how delighted I am to be here today with all of you as we review the Perceptions and Insights 2025 study. So, Anique, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Ken. All right, maybe we can move on to the next slide. And I, along with my colleague Shalom, and I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, Shalom, in a moment. We'll review some of the highlights of this latest study with you. And we'll close out today with our two special guests, Ashley and Allison, with a panel discussion. So Ashley and Allison, do you mind introducing yourselves briefly?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Ann Laura. I'm a patient advocate and consultant within the eczema and atopic dermatitis space, and I am a clinical trial participant.
Great, thank you. And Allison?
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison. I am an 8-year cancer survivor. I began a trial 7 years ago. I'm still on that trial, and I am a passionate advocate for clinical trials and for cancer research.
Thank you so much for those introductions, and we look forward to having the panel discussion with you all a little bit later. Shalom, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Anique. My name is Shalom Sain. I am a senior manager and quantitative insights specialist on the research services team at CISCRP. Very excited to be here and share some of the findings of the Perceptions and Insights study today.
Great, thank you. All right, so for today, what we're going to do is we have the presentation, if we can move to the next slide, Shalom, split up into several different sections. And some of these sections will include the general public awareness and perceptions of clinical research. And again, looking at this over time, looking at some of the critical informational elements when it comes to the decision to participate and what's most important in terms of supportive elements that need to be in place in order for someone to participate. And then we'll close out the session by talking about participation experiences, basically what are some of the burdens that they experienced and how were, their overall experiences, as well as a new section that we had this year on artificial intelligence perceptions. And then we'll close out with the panel discussion. On the next slide, we'll just have a brief high-level overview of the methodology for this study. But essentially, we work with a cross-functional work group to develop the questionnaire, and we typically use prior study questionnaires as sort of a baseline, and we always incorporate new topics in the questionnaire. For example, we looked at social media channels for recruitment in a little bit more in depth. This year, we looked at AI. We looked at, what are some of the considerations when somebody's considering several different studies? What are some considerations when they're looking to select a particular study? A special thank you to some of our partners that supported us in carrying out this survey to their networks: Rare Patient Voice, James Lind Care, and Clarinis. Special thank you and our gratitude for supporting this important project. Really exciting this year. We surpassed our 12,000 response goal. We actually finished the study with 12,887 responses. And in our next slide, we just have a high-level overview of some of the characteristics of our sample over time. You'll see on the right-hand side the 2025 characteristics. We have a nice balance of gender, regions. This year, we were able to incorporate a little bit higher sample sizes from South America, the Asia Pacific region, and Africa. While our sample is still largely white in terms of top mentions and non-Hispanic, due to the large sample size, we are able to have substantive sample size numbers for underrepresented communities, et cetera. So we just wanted to call that out. And then this year also, we have a little bit of higher representation among those that were less, have a high school or lower education level. We also have a good sample of those who, clinical trial participants. It was a little over 30% in that regard as well. At this time, I'll turn it over to you, Shalom, to review some of our general perceptions.
Great. Thank you so much, Anik. So diving into some of the key findings of the 2025 Perceptions and Insights study, and starting with a section here on general awareness and perceptions of clinical trials and clinical research among patients and the public. Some key highlights from this section: overall, general perceptions remain steady. Generally speaking, most respondents continue to indicate strong understanding of clinical research and good awareness of clinical trials. We do continue to see that trust in pharma lags behind other organizations involved in clinical research. We did ask some questions about how to build trust in pharma. We found that transparency and patient engagement activities were cited as key strategies to help build trust. And among some underrepresented populations, knowing that the company included a diverse set of participants and employed staff that was diverse was also a top mentioned trust building strategy. We also asked about levels of interest in attending a community event to learn more about clinical research and clinical trials, and we found that on the whole, there was strong interest in attending this type of event, especially among younger respondents, those who were residing in the Americas, and those identifying as Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, or Hispanic or Latino. To give a broad overview of awareness, understanding, and willingness to participate in clinical trials, on the whole, we continue to see that most indicate they understand the term clinical research study or clinical trial somewhat or very well, and would generally be somewhat or very willing to participate. You can see that between 2023 and 2025, there was a little bit of a drop in these. And just to note as well, in terms of understanding of the term clinical research study and clinical trial, the drop between 2023 and 2025 was primarily driven by our respondents in Europe. In terms of awareness as well, the slight majority of our respondents did indicate that they remember seeing or hearing about a clinical research study that was looking for volunteers in the past 6 months. But this does constitute, again, a little bit of a drop compared to 2023. Overall, there were higher self-reported levels of understanding, awareness, and willingness to participate as education level increased. There were higher levels of self-reported understanding, awareness, and willingness to participate in North America compared to other world regions. And as in past years, we do continue to see strong willingness to participate persist among underrepresented communities. So for example, those who indicated that they were Black or African American, and half of those who identified as American Indian or Alaska Native indicated that they would be very willing to participate in a clinical research study. So looking at focusing on the sample, those who indicated that they did see or hear about a clinical research study in the past 6 months, the top source of this information was that they heard or saw about a clinical trial online. The top source of information online was social media, and the top cited social media platform was Facebook, probably because of the number of patient advocacy groups and patient support groups that we see hosted on the Facebook social media platform. Calling out here that only 16% heard about a clinical trial through their research center doctor or staff conducting the study, and only 8% heard through their own doctor. We did ask how folks would prefer to learn about a clinical trial, and we saw, as in past years, that people continue to prefer to learn about a clinical trial through their doctor or the research center doctor or staff conducting the study. So as in past years, we do continue to see this disconnect between how people would prefer to learn about clinical trials through their doctor versus how they actually learn about clinical trials, which tend to be which tends to be more online and through advertisements. We do continue to see that trust in pharmaceutical companies continues to lag behind other organizations involved in clinical research, for example, research centers and clinics and healthcare providers, government research organizations, and government regulatory agencies. These findings are generally consistent with previous years. We typically see that trust in pharmaceutical companies is lower compared to these other types of organizations. We do see that there is somewhat of increased trust among those who have participated in clinical trials in the past. And high trust in pharma is most prevalent among was most prevalent among those who were Black or African American, but lowest among those who identified as American Indian or Alaska Native. We did ask this year about levels of interest in attending a community event where people could learn more about clinical research and clinical trials. And we found that the majority of the respondents indicated that they were somewhat or very interested in participating in this or attending this type of event. Interest levels did vary by world region. Those residing in Africa and the Americas were more likely to indicate strong interest in attending this type of event compared to other world regions. As a general trend, younger age groups were more likely to indicate strong interest. And strong interest was most prevalent among those who were Black or African American, those who were American Indian or Alaska Native, and those who identified as Hispanic or Latino as well. Moving into the next section on engagement preferences, where we'll sort of dive into some of the ways that people would prefer to participate in a clinical trial and ways to support those enrolled in clinical trials. So looking at among those who have never participated in a clinical trial before, comfort levels remain generally high when considering decentralized clinical trial elements, for example, conducting study visits at other or more local locations. There are some locations where comfort levels are potentially not as high, but on the whole, comfort levels do remain high with these decentralized clinical trial elements. The top related drivers to staying enrolled in a clinical trial were seeing or feeling benefit from the study drug, receiving compensation, and having study visits located at a convenient location. We did also see that there was very strong comfort in terms of the idea of sharing health data via a wearable device. People were, on the whole, very comfortable with the idea of sharing their health data via a wearable device as part of participation in a clinical trial. However, when looking at comfort levels with sharing cell phone data, these comfort levels were not as high, and we'll dive into these a little bit more as well. We also continue to see, and this is a consistent theme across the years and also aligns with what we often hear from patients and patient advisory boards and other engagement activities, there's a strong interest in receiving their own individual results if they were to participate in a clinical trial, as well as the overall results of the study. Broadly speaking, most respondents would prefer to receive this information via email. But we often hear from our patients that it's important to provide options when, between paper or email in terms of meeting patient preferences here as well. So looking at comfort levels with some examples of decentralized clinical trial elements, we found that on the whole, comfort levels continue to remain high for when we ask people how comfortable they would be with, for example, having study visits at their regular doctor's office, conducting simple medical assessments on their own at home, or using a wearable device. Generally speaking, even among those who have never participated in a clinical trial before, there is a high prevalence of those who indicated that they would be very comfortable with each of these considerations. In general, there were highest comfort levels in Africa and North America compared to other world regions. Generally, comfort levels across the board tended to increase among those with higher education levels. And we also looked at some findings by treatment area as well this year. We found that those with a medical condition indicated higher comfort levels compared to those without a medical condition across the board when considering these decentralized clinical trial elements. So for example, those with a medical condition in the rare disease, autoimmune, and oncology treatment areas indicated the greatest level of comfort with completing simple medical assessments on their own at home. Moving into a broad overview of key retention factors, we asked our respondents to rank each of these items in terms of which would be most to least likely to support them in remaining enrolled in a clinical trial for the full duration. As in past years, we continue to see that feeling or seeing benefit from the study drug is the top retention consideration here. But this is followed by receiving compensation for time, having the ability to complete study visits closer to home, being able to see medical test results, and reimbursing out-of-pocket expenses. You'll see these themes sort of continue throughout this webinar, the idea that compensation and reimbursement can support the participation experience, anything that can be done to reduce logistical burdens, having study visits closer to home, and being able to have their own medical test results shared back with them, receiving overall study results as well. These continue to be cited as some top strategies to support the participation experience and encourage people to remain enrolled for the full duration of a clinical trial. We asked about comfort levels with sharing health data via wearable devices. We saw very strong comfort. Over 90% indicated that they would be somewhat or very comfortable sharing, for example, heart rate, blood oxygen level, temperature, and so on, these types of health data via a wearable device. Comfort levels were especially high among women. Generally, there were higher comfort levels with increasing income and education levels. And comfort levels with sharing health data via a wearable device during a clinical trial were highest among those identifying as Black or African American and those identifying as American Indian or Alaska Native, but were lower among those identifying as Hispanic compared to those identifying as non-Hispanic. When comparing the comfort levels with sharing data via wearable devices, which we saw was very high, to the idea of sharing phone data as part of participation in a clinical trial, our respondents were not as receptive to the idea of sharing their phone data, their cell phone data, as part of participation in a clinical trial. Especially considering the contents of their text messages. This was the type of data that patients and our respondents were least receptive to sharing as part of their participation in a clinical trial. Generally speaking, there was less receptivity to the idea of sharing the contents of text messages. As we've seen in past years, there continues to be strong interest in receiving individual and overall study results. We see this throughout the years in the Perceptions and Insights study, and this also aligns with what we often hear from our patients. When we engage in patient advisory boards and other patient engagement activities, patients want to feel encouraged and supported, and they want to be kept in the loop during their participation in a clinical trial. And sharing results back with them can go a long way in achieving that. So we saw that 81% of our respondents indicated they would want to see and they would be interested in seeing their individual study results. And a high proportion also indicated that they would be interested in seeing a summary of the study results as well. Among those who indicated they would like to see their individual study results, these findings are generally consistent with previous years. Among those who indicated they would like to see their individual study results, we did drill down a little bit this year into asking what kinds of individual results they would be most interested in receiving. And we really found that the majority of our respondents indicated they want to see sort of all of the above. They're interested in receiving blood tests, imaging results, genetic test results, vitals, doctor visit notes. Over 50% indicated they would like to see all of these, which highlights the idea that sharing back as much information with participants as possible can help to support the participation experience and encourage people to feel supported and engaged in the clinical trial participation process. Moving into the next section here on deciding to participate and sort of giving an overview of the journey and the pathway towards participation and some key considerations that patients face when they're making that decision about whether they are going to participate in a clinical trial. Some key highlights here. As in past years, many of those who had tried to participate but did not participate in a clinical trial did not do so primarily because they just didn't meet the eligibility criteria. They didn't qualify to participate. And among this group, there are many who are still seeking clinical trial participation opportunities. We also heard that there was a good proportion of those who did not participate because they just hadn't heard back from the study staff or had to wait too long or never heard back from the study staff in terms of next steps towards participation. In terms of making information needed when deciding whether to participate in a clinical trial, the most important types of information needed included logistical aspects such as the study requirements, the physical location of the research center, potential study-related costs and compensation and reimbursement as well. And like Anik alluded to earlier, we did ask this year to specifically, ask our respondents if they were choosing between two studies, what would be some of the key considerations that would maybe encourage people to select one study over another. The top considerations were details about each study drug, opportunities for reimbursement, and physical location distance from the study clinic, between their study clinic and their home. So among our respondents who have not participated in a clinical trial in the past, 30% had tried to participate. We asked this group what was the primary reason that they did not participate in a clinical trial. The top response here was that they didn't qualify, they didn't meet the eligibility criteria. This was followed by no one contacted me or I had to wait too long to hear back from the study staff. Among those who didn't qualify, we asked what happened after they found out they didn't qualify. You can see that the majority, 82%, were still searching for clinical research studies to participate in, so still searching for participation opportunities. Among those who never heard back or had to wait too long to hear back, 48%, when we asked how long they waited, 48% indicated that they never heard back, highlighting again the importance of communication and the potential barrier to participation that lack of communication can place when considering, the pathway towards participation. In terms of making the top most important information desired before making the decision to participate, and considering specifically the logistical aspects of participation as well. The top consideration here were the study requirements, so the types and number of procedures and how often they will take place. And again, the physical location of the research center continues to be a top consideration here as well as potential study-related costs, reimbursement, and compensation, and the time commitment from the start to the end of the study. Generally across the board here, those with higher education levels were most likely to indicate high importance for each of these considerations. And on the whole, these findings are consistent with previous years. So this year, we did ask our respondents to imagine they were considering participation in 2 different clinical research studies and deciding which one to participate in. We asked them to let us know, among these response options, which are the top considerations that would be most important to you when selecting one study over another. The top response option here was details about each study drug, the mechanism of action, the availability of results on safety and efficacy data. We really saw that this was a key consideration here. People really want to know as much information as possible about each study drug of each study. This was followed by considerations around reimbursement and participation related expenses. And once again, physical location and distance of between the respondent's home and the study clinic continues to be a top consideration when making this participation decision as well. And with that, I will turn it back to Anik.
Thank you so much, Shalom. Now I will go into the subset of participants that completed the survey that actually had participated in a clinical trial. So anyone who indicated they had participated would have been directed to a separate section of our survey. Some of the highlights of this section include the following. And we split up the highlights in 3 different sections. So before participation, during participation, and after. So some of the highlights here, before participation, about a quarter learned about their trials online, again, through social media. And we've seen this in the past frequently also in terms of some of the major drivers for joining a clinical trial are altruistic. We also, consistent with last year, saw that electronic consent forms continue to be perceived as the easiest to understand when compared to paper or video types of informed consent. During participation, and again, as Shalom mentioned, it's a huge consideration for people that have never participated as well. But, those logistical factors are and continue to be, the primary sources of disruption and top source of burden. In terms of the use of technology, we had some additional questions here, and what's good about 3/4 never had any issues with their technology, but we did find that those that did have issues tended to just contact the study staff directly, which obviously creates burden for the study staff members, of course. And then we also asked some questions around compensation and reimbursement, where we found some regional differences there as well. In terms of after participation, we did see some progress in terms of the number and proportion of individuals that received updates following their completion of the study. And it's good that, there was a lower proportion of people that indicated that they never heard anything back. And then overall, if we look at the indicators of overall satisfaction with their experiences, it continues to be very consistent, very positive. So diving deeper into just some of the characteristics of these study participants, you'll see here they participated of those who could remember or recalled. It was a variety of different phase types of studies, different therapeutic areas. The number of study visits on average for a traditional clinical trial averaged about 7. With 80% completing the study, and most participated in interventional studies with those traditional in-clinic visits. So looking at the segment before participation, where do people, the people that participated first learn about the clinical research study? I think, as Shalom alluded to earlier, there are a variety of sources that are, cited as where they first learned about a clinical trial. Most importantly, the online source continues to grow. And in fact, again, in terms of where exactly online they're finding this information, a lot of it is through, like we said, social media. And to Shalom's earlier point also, Facebook continues to be a top kind of social media channel that's used to first learn about a potential clinical study. Still some progress to be made here. The 16% of my doctor, ideally, as we've mentioned earlier, they really want to learn about the study through their doctor. So there is still that disconnect here that we need to work on as an industry. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are there to help future generations, help progress the development of treatments for their condition, et cetera. So lots of altruistic drivers for participating, which we generally see every other year when we conduct these studies. These findings are very consistent. In terms of informed consent, what we've seen is a slight increase from 2 years ago in terms of the use of electronic informed consent. It went up from 32%, Shalom, if we could advance the slide, to 40%. And there was also a slight increase in video consent as well. of course, the majority is still paper. The good news is that it appears there was a slight increase for the paper people that completed or used paper versions, slight increase in terms of the shortest consent form. So the number of pages actually decreased overall, which is good. Looking at how easy it is to understand, generally speaking, you see here that electronic versions of the consent form were perceived to be the easiest to understand. Obviously with the new advances in technology, being able to zoom in, being able to, mark and bookmark certain sections for later follow-up with the study clinic doctors, et cetera, to ask questions is very useful for participants, which we hear often when we engage with patients. And again, when we ask them, how long did it take you to review the ICF? The majority said an hour or less. Likely they are skipping a lot of sections, obviously, but and just trying to skim through and trying to identify what are some of those most important sections that they're skimming through. But generally speaking, there was a slight decrease in overall ICF understanding, which of course, with the increasing complexity of clinical trials and, everything that's included in the informed consent form, it makes sense. Of those that found the form difficult to understand, obviously length was a factor. The use of medical jargon often is a detractor and makes things confusing and difficult for participants. Some mentioned, that the layout was confusing or some of the charts and tables were difficult to understand. So again, just pointing some of these things out that as an industry, we can kind of look at and see as we're moving forward to try to make these informed consent form templates a little bit more digestible and easier to understand. These are some areas that we can take a look at. During participation, some highlights included basically identified a few items. And I mentioned, logistical factors continue to be a top item. We saw this 2 years ago as well. We included a specific probe on biopsy procedures, not surprising that obviously that was a major, given the invasiveness of the procedure, it was a major area of burden. But like I said, a lot of the other items, length of study visits and the travel to the study clinic was perceived as a burden. Again, we did see a significant amount of time traveling to the study clinic one way, where over the majority traveled at least 30 minutes to an hour or more one way to the clinic. And on average, typically we ask, how long do you spend at the study clinic? And here again, we see that about 70% or so spend at least 30 minutes to longer, to a couple of hours during their study visits. So obviously things to focus on, not having to travel as far to get to the study clinic. To Shalom's point earlier, what are some local labs or local clinics that can be leveraged so patients don't have to travel as far? Compensation for time was a big factor also. So not just reimbursement of expenses, but, the significant time commitment they spend at these study visits, et cetera, losing work, et cetera. It's a big commitment. And then again, having help assistance, supporting transportation to the study clinic. We always hear that as well. And, hopefully making the study visits shorter, of course, is always helpful as well. If we look at the next slide, this is a new set of questions we included, as we're using technology more and more, obviously people, there's always technical issues. So when looking at, technical difficulties, a lot of times patients reach out to sites, which when we speak with, study coordinators and principal investigators in some of our projects, we hear this all the time as well, right? So it creates a burden for the site. So the good news is about 72% didn't experience any problems, but for the rest, it was more around, device operation, difficulty, wearing the device, especially the wearables where it requires 24/7 you know, use, for example. You know, perhaps some of the instructions weren't as clear as they could have been. Or they just didn't know where to go for help. So, or, you know, internet connections, et cetera, were some of the issues that were experienced. You know, a lot of people do try to mitigate these issues on their own by, you know, troubleshooting on their own, or, you know, or sometimes they do have a technical support number that they reach out to, which is good as well. So, generally speaking, we asked them how easy or difficult was it to resolve some of these issues. There is quite a chunk of the pie here where they experienced some difficulty. So definitely room for improvement here in terms of mitigating, you know, and providing the appropriate support for some of the potential issues that could arise. We asked them also, you know, if they experienced any issues completing the study requirements. And the good news is about 80% didn't have any issues. Those that had issues mentioned under the other category, it was more around like side effects or lack of efficacy, or, you know, having the placebo placebo issues were some of the things that were mentioned under the other category here. But, you know, some other things that they mentioned were study procedures being too invasive or painful, travel related issues, or you know, study visits that were too time consuming, et cetera, or just generally speaking, too many study requirements overall. So, moving on to the next slide, we also asked a question about just generally forgetting, or, you know, what is some of the reasoning behind missing some of the dosing of the study therapies. So about 80% indicated they never missed a study dose, but there was a percentage, 8%, that missed a dose. And some of the reasons for that was that they simply just forgot, or they experienced side effects, or there was some sort of shipping delay, or they had some trouble with the medical device, et cetera, or again, the instructions were unclear. So again, you know, certainly opportunities for reminders and such, and, you know, different channels for reminding individuals to take their study medication is always something to take a look at as well. So again, I mentioned, you know, compensation for time or reimbursement for expenses that people incurred. So people indicated about 44% indicated receiving payments for completing certain study requirements, or indicated that they received reimbursement for some of their travel expenses. But there is a substantial amount of people that didn't receive compensation at all. So again, you know, we know that this is an important driver for retention and enrollment, given the significant time commitment. You know, you certainly don't want someone coming out of pocket for participating in a clinical trial. And of course, by world region, you know, obviously we take, you know, local regulations in mind, and, you know, certainly in some of these regions, you know, there are strict requirements around that. So that would certainly explain why there were different practices in different regions when it comes to compensation. You know, and different methodologies for receiving their compensations. Check was number one. A lot of individuals also received those prepaid debit cards, or, you know, cash, which was found to be most convenient. So after participation, we've made some progress here in terms of, you know, from 2023, there was an increase in individuals that did receive an update after they finished the clinical research study, where, you know, it was a lot of people in the past have felt like, you know, after they've had that last study visit, they never heard anything back. So a lot of people felt kind of abandoned, so to speak. So it is great that we're making progress here and getting results back to individuals. And, you know, obviously there were some variations in regions in terms of how common that happened. We had some additional questions around what information they received, you know, a summary of the study results, individual study results, with people indicating the individual study results in particular were perceived to be very helpful, whether, which group they were in terms of study drug or placebo. And also having information on the drug approval status in their own countries was also important. Those that did receive individual study results or, unblinding cards, so to speak, found that to be fairly easy to understand. So some of the key factors that we look at to determine whether, overall satisfaction with their clinical trial participation experience, as I mentioned earlier, usually it's very, very high. Most say that overall it met or exceeded expectations, their experience in the clinical trial, that their care and attention they received is the same or even better that what they would have received in their clinical care. And most would, probably or definitely recommend participation to family and friends, which is great. And they would be willing to participate again. And again, just want to underscore the importance of clinical trial study staff, the ones that interact and engage directly with these participants. They really also play a huge factor in shaping their experience. And generally, like I mentioned, these were very consistent from past years. And finally, our artificial intelligence section. So of course, we know this is a very hot topic these days. And again, we say self-report here because, if you were to actually evaluate whether or not, people actually understood or are familiar with exactly what artificial intelligence is, you'd probably find there's a little bit of a discrepancy here. But generally speaking, most are, familiar at a high level with artificial intelligence. In clinical research, transparency is critical, especially if a study uses artificial intelligence to, in some way, in their clinical trials. And most, again, self-reportedly, were somewhat comfortable or very comfortable with AI, being used to analyze some of their data. Obviously, those that were concerned, it was more around accuracy issues. And then finally, some of the, we asked like what type of data would they be comfortable with AI analyzing, and it was heart rate, physical activity level, number of steps. Those were all fine. A little bit of a lower comfort level when it came to analyzing more complex study results like imaging or medical records and things of that nature. So something that's certainly interesting. So generally, again, I think everybody's learning about AI and it's kind of an ongoing learning process. So I think at a high level, people are generally familiar with what this is. And then again, I mentioned, underscoring transparency. If, AI is being used, it's really important to make it clear that that's what the case is, especially as part of a clinical research study. And then finally, the majority would be very comfortable having AI process their medical data. Again, I mentioned accuracy concerns and data security concerns and privacy concerns were also a big, factor following closely behind accuracy. And then I mentioned the different, types of data that they would be comfortable sharing. All right. So what are some of the key takeaways? And then we can move on into our panel discussion. But essentially, creating inclusive trials will, of course, require a continuous initiatives to build trust, in pharmaceutical organizations. And again, it goes back to like transparent communications, working locally with communities before there's a need, and really building those relationships. Supporting that decision-making process, educational materials about clinical research, clinical trials in general is always very helpful. And, making sure, especially if people are in a space where there's multiple clinical trials and people are choosing between several trials in collaboration with their doctors, it's always good to have clear details on the investigational study drug potentially and other elements of the trial if they're comparing. even though people indicated a high comfort level with technology in clinical trials, it doesn't negate the need for support. So having those mechanisms in place in case people experience trouble is always important. We want to minimize not only patient burden, but site burden as well. Location, logistics, compensation, very important for recruitment and retention. And that communication and engagement following participation is always very important, not only in aggregate, but individual results as well. And then I mentioned in closing the AI use in clinical trials and the human involvement piece of it. So we realized that was a lot of data, but I wanted to transition over to our panel discussion with our two guest speakers. Welcome again, Ashley and Allison. And I know we just reviewed a lot of data, but you both have experience with interventional clinical trials. Can you chime in? Like, how can you relate to any of these findings at all?
I'll kick us off. I can absolutely relate to those findings, especially when we talk about the 22% who discovered their clinical trial through online and social media. That was definitely my experience. I don't know if some of y'all remember Craigslist, but that is actually
Oh,
where
yeah.
I found my clinical trial, which is very interesting. So it's just a reminder that in general, social media and online, when used responsibly, can really support and bridge that gap between patients and research. I also found it powerful that the 12% of participants heard about a clinical trial through their community leaders, which is well above even the 8% who heard about it through their doctors, which again just shows the importance of partnering up with patient advocates in the community to support with clinical trial awareness. Lastly, the one that I felt maybe did not resonate with me was the statistics showing that 1 in 3 participants heard back after their trial ended. I love that statistic is getting less and less, and there are more people who are hearing about it. But unfortunately, that wasn't my experience. The study was stopped abruptly for me after the drug became approved, and I never heard back. And so it was like I spent over a year being a part of this clinical trial, and to end it that way just did not feel good to me. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. Thank you so much, Ashley. How about you, Allison? How did you, what did you think of the results, and how does it relate to your own clinical trial experience?
Well, that was a great segue because I actually did hear from my doctor as soon as the trial was FDA approved. And he just called me saying, thank you for being a participant and thank you for helping carve this and be a pioneer. Whenever you said, compensation and the location of the clinic are some of the items that most participants are going to consider. I 100% agree with that. My clinical trial did reimburse me, and the location for travel and for staying at the hotel nearby. But I have partnered up with different advocacies, and one of them led me to this lady who lived in Cleveland, but the trial for her was going to be in Baltimore and they were not going to compensate her. So she chose not to do the trial and she ended up passing away. And so I think that is just the biggest thing, that the patient should not have to feel responsible for that. They already have enough on their plate. So I think that that should be on the trial. They're doing enough for that. And I think it really comes down to educating doctors. I think that when a patient has success on a clinical trial, they're going to be eager to tell people. For example, I had such great success. I wrote a book and published it on Amazon. I spread the message. And so there's so there's so much that I can do, but if the doctors have a roadblock and they say, no, it's conventional treatments and they're not educated, then I think that's where the real hurdle is.
Right, right. No, thank you so much for bringing up those points. That's really important. What were some of the from based on your own experience, like what were some of the highlights of your experience, and what were some things that you would consider or suggest changing to make better? You know, obviously compensation is definitely one of them, Allison, right?
Yeah, that was just an added bonus for me,
Mm-hmm.
actually. Fortunately, that wasn't a make or break thing for me. I
Mm-hmm.
know that there's probably so many people that it is something that they have to consider. I was so sick and I was making a decision of life or, the quantity versus quality,
Mm-hmm.
basically. And so I kind of put all my eggs in the basket for this trial because it wasn't approved yet. It was still in phase 1.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just so desperate for quality of life. But the doctors are really, really excited that I started it and they were really confident. That helps my family build their confidence. And so once I started seeing the success after the first 3 months, I had a scan and my tumors had shrunk like 38%. I knew that this was, I was bought it and I wanted to see how much further I could go.
Yeah,
And now I've been on the trial for 7 years.
that's wonderful. Ashley, how about you? What were some of the highlights and some things you might suggest changing, and even, thinking also about like some of the logistical factors and other,
Yeah.
elements that might be.
Definitely some of the highlights were the staff for me. The staff was amazing in making sure that I knew when I was coming in, my appointment times, just sending reminders. So that was extremely helpful for me. Top notch would be the benefit of the study drug and the fact that it actually worked for me. And
Mm,
I totally agree with Allison in that we will spread the news. Like when we know it works for us, we will spread the news. And that's exactly what I did when I found out that this drug was working for me. Something that I feel like could have been better, at least at that time, was the ICF. And I didn't really understand anything at that time. I was
mm,
not a patient advocate. And so I actually sent the ICF to my brother, who's a doctor, and said, hey, just give me a thumbs up. Is this good or not good? And it was due to some of the things that were mentioned because it was too long, because I didn't understand some of the language. Um, I felt like the need to pass it on to my brother, who I felt like did understand that information,
mm,
and gave me the thumbs up to continue to participate in the clinical trial.
mm. Well, that's great experience to share about the ICF. How was the informed consent process for you, Allison?
Sorry. It was very lengthy. I still have to sign to any new consent that comes out. Any kind of side effect or change in verbiage, I have to sign the consent for. It was very, very long. It was electronic and it seems so long ago, but I fortunately had both of my parents with me and they are in the medical field. So I agree with Ashley. You need another set of eyes to go
Mm,
over it because in my situation, I was so sick. I was so desperate. I pretty much was willing to sign up for anything. But there were definitely protocols that I had to follow in order to qualify. There were things I had to do to ensure I qualified. Um, and and fortunately I did, but I know there's a lot of people that did not qualify for that and have to
mm.
continue searching for trials.
Yeah. And what might be helpful for those people that didn't end up qualifying and they're still searching? Like what do you think might be helpful for that group?
Educating the physicians so that opportunities are given to them, that they don't have to go and find the opportunities themselves. When I had mentioned, that I was done with the conventional treatment, I wanted to see what quality I had. My doctor said, well, you can contact, a larger institution to see if there are any trials. And so I did contact them, and they are a research hospital, and they were able to get me in. But so just calling around and researching. And so I think it just boils down to getting the word out and making sure that the people that you trust, I mean, you trust your oncologist, you trust your doctors with your health that you're going to, so you're going to do what they say. But if they don't give you all of the options, then you're kind of limited.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Ashley, what advice would you have if somebody came up to you and said, "Oh, I'm considering a clinical trial." What advice would you give?
Yeah, I would tell that person to ask a lot of questions and
Mm-hmm.
ask them as often as you'd like, and as keep asking. Just keep asking the same questions until you fully understand what you're getting yourself into. I know for me, I wish I asked about the time that it would take, the frequency, and what would happen if the trial stops early, and just understanding the different possibilities of what could take place throughout a clinical trial journey for that, for a patient, for myself. And so yeah, I would just say ask as many questions as you can, similar to what Allison said. Get a new set of eyes, especially when it comes to the ICF, and get a second opinion. Involve your friends and family if they are available, and if that is something that you feel called to or feel comfortable with. Because I involved my brother and I involved my family, they were such a huge support throughout my clinical trial process. Like, how's it going? Tell me what side effects you're experiencing. And so just really supporting me throughout the process. And I highly recommend anybody who is going through a clinical trial process to have someone or a support system there for you.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's excellent advice. What about you, Allison? What advice would you give?
I completely agree with Ashley. I think that you can't go into a clinical trial alone. You have to have some kind of support, whether it's your family, your spouse, or a support group. There are so many different patient advocacy programs that people with success like me and Ashley are a part of. So, I've seen all of the I've experienced, and I am the success of this drug. And so now I can give advice or be that support for other people that might want to go into clinical trials or might be in my demographics, age, and or might have the same type of cancer that I have. So I definitely think the support group, I think lots of questions. I think that as much as you want to have success on a trial, like I wanted to not cure cancer, but I wanted to be able to live with it. Um, they want you to. They want you to be able to, they want you to be on their studies so that they can get their data. So I think that it's really important that you give yourself that grace and you are your own advocate, and um you fight for, your success.
Thank you so much. Um, Ashley and Allison, thank you so much for making the time to join us in this discussion. And unfortunately, we're at the end of the hour already, but wanted to thank everybody, and wanted to just mention a couple of quick next steps. Shalom, if you can bring up the report. So I know we went through a lot of data today. The good news is that we will be uploading the reports to the websites in early November. But new this year, and we're very excited to showcase this for you all, is our interactive data dashboard, which will enable you to manipulate some of the charts with different variables. We're piloting this year, and we'd love your feedback on how well it works. And there will be instructions, etc. More to come on that shortly. That should be out in November as well. And if you have any questions, and since extremely grateful to all of our supporters as well. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Shalom. We'd be happy to pass along the questions. I know we had a lot of questions in the Q&A. We will be following up, and I apologize that we didn't address those during the webinar, but we'll follow up separately with answers to all of your questions. Thank you again for joining us.